Have a lot of time to talk questions. There's some information that we both included in our slides that's really complimentary. So I'll go a little shorter on those slides and we'll still have some good time to talk with each other today. How many folks are in the room today who are doing basic science research? Are there groups here? Okay. How many folks are doing more social sciences research in the room? Okay. How many folks are community identified, coming from a community in partnership? And how many folks are academic identified? Okay, good. We have a nice spread, I think, of partners in the room. So I want to tell you a little bit about the main things we're going to talk about today are how to find funding sources, learning a bit more about how grant applications are reviewed, some tips and insights on building a strong application, and then some additional training resources for CDPR. So two of the things, or two or three of the different groups that are on this slide here, Community Campus Partnerships for Health is an incredible resource. Has anyone, can you raise your hand if you've heard of them before? Okay, so about half the room. So they have a really outstanding listserv that talks all about many different aspects of the CDPR process. One of the great things about their listserv is if you pose a question to them and you get a lot of responses, the people on that listserv who pose the question will always sort of compile the answers that they get and send it back out to the listserv. That's a unique thing that I've seen them practice consistently. And it's a huge plus for everyone else on the listserv because just because they ask the question doesn't mean that they only get the answer, but they send it back out to everybody else on the listserv so you all get informed. The Northwest Health Foundation is another group that I've highlighted here because they have a directory of funding sources for CDPR. There's also some national funders of CDPR. The National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities has a specific grant mechanism, and I'm not sure exactly where they are in their call for that mechanism, but they are a good group to look at their website and see what it is that they're funding right now. The National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences also funds CBPR research. And they're a really good group to look at because they have a particular focus on environmental justice and environmental health disparities. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about CBPR funding opportunities at CBCRP. The California Breast Cancer Research Program was established 20 years ago. And for 15 of those years, we've actually been funding CBPR research. I want to tell you what we mean when we talk about CBPR research. So we're really focusing on equal sharing of coming up with the research question, to sharing the research dollars, to actually doing the research, and then telling everyone about what you found. So that's the key principles behind when we talk about CBPR. We really mean equal sharing at all ends of the spectrum when you're doing this kind of research. I put up a slide on priority issues here. So these are the 4 very broad categories that we fund in. And CBPR can occur in any one of these areas when you're engaging the community and the community PI is working with an academic PI to come up with the question all the way through execution and dissemination. I'm going to talk to you more about the Community Research Collaboration Awards. So as I mentioned, the core principles are equity at all stages. And this has been a constant for 15 years of this mechanism. So very much due to the vision of the council that guides CBCRP. I'm totally going to mess up with these acronyms all morning, I can tell. But basically the council that actually guides the CBCRP in their day-to-day work, they have made it a huge priority to fund this kind of research, to actually fund equity in partnerships. So Norval did a beautiful job of describing what a pilot mechanism and what a full mechanism is. There's just a couple of differences in terms of the money and the amount of time. So we have a pilot mechanism that funds $150,000 over a year and a half. And then we have a full award mechanism that funds $600,000 over 3 years. And the real point I want to make here too, to complement what Norval talked about earlier, is indirect costs. So on top of the actual grant dollars that you get to do the research, in addition, you get money to keep the lights on, to actually administer the grant. So when you hear the term indirect costs, it's basically, in this case, for our funders, it's money on top of your direct costs, your direct research dollars. This week, I believe this partnership presented here at the training. So Círculo de Vida Cancer Support and Resource Center and UCSF partnered on a grant that took a sort of an intervention that was very much evidence-based, and they needed to culturally tailor it and make it appropriate for Spanish-speaking women who were cancer survivors. So this is an example of a type of grant that has been funded before by CBCRP. And I want to tell you a little bit about the awards timeline at CBCRP this year. So in September, we're going to have an optional review of research plans, so just the 10 pages if you're doing a pilot, or the 15 pages if you're doing a full award application. It gets sent to us, and we send it out to experts in CBPR, and they give you feedback on 4 aspects of it. So 2 aspects are about the strength of your research question, and 2 aspects are about the quality of your partnership and the benefit to the community. So our applications themselves are actually due on December 2nd, and then a face page, you actually have to send in via PDF through email a face page. In February of next year, we're going to review the applications, and then the actual funding decisions will be made in March of 2014. So there's a lot of technical assistance available. And if you come away from this meeting with nothing else, just remember, contact program officers. A big part of their job is really about providing assistance to grantees who are interested, or even applicants who are interested in applying for grants. So don't feel as if, oh, I can't ask them questions. That's the whole reason we're employed. So if you don't get anything else out of this presentation, really know that you can contact us, especially Norval and I, and ask us questions about what you're thinking of doing, and wondering if it's a fit for the Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program or the California Breast Cancer Research Program. There are also going to be webinars that we'll hold this year. And I want to tell you a little bit about the review process. So basically, when grants come into us, they go through 2 stages of review. First, they're going to go to scientific review that looks at its merits on 4 different aspects, 2 that are focused on science and 2 that are focused on partnership. Then it's going to go to a different body that focuses on programmatic relevance. So is it really hitting at the priority areas that we've set out? And is it really fitting the mechanism type? So are you really, in this case, are you really doing something that is a community and academic collaboration? Only thing I'd add here is that it's scored 1 to 10 points on all 4 of those criteria, and then the scores for all the reviewers are averaged for each criteria. So you get 4 scores on each of the areas plus a total score. When the application goes to programmatic review, they're focusing on very specific things about your application. So they're not looking at the science, they're looking at how does it respond to the program's needs. And they don't actually see the science scores. Yeah, I see a question.
Is this kind of the same format that is for national-wide, or this is California?
This format here is built on what's done at National Institutes of Health. Okay. So at National Institutes of Health, they'll go to scientific review, and then they'll go to sort of it's called a CSA, but it's sort of the programmatic level review. So it mirrors what's done at the national level.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So what I was mentioning about the scientific piece of it is that the council who makes the funding recommendations doesn't actually see your scientific scores until after they've made their scores for programmatic review. And so that they're not doing this sort of, second guessing what the scientists have already done in looking at your application. Then they take both scores into account when making funding recommendations. So the reason I included this slide here is that for anyone who's considering applying to the CDCRP, it's really important that you know that only a piece of your application actually goes to programmatic review. And so these forms that have the asterisks after them are the forms that will actually be reviewed programmatically by the body that makes the funding decisions. So it's really important that you have your scientific, so all the forms go to scientific review, both columns on this slide, but a subset go to programmatic review. Why I'm bringing this up or talking about this at length is that you have to think about this, that you're putting together two applications in one. So you're putting together the full application, the whole application, but you have to think about what you're including on those forms with the asterisk, because those are the only forms that go to the group that decides whether or not you get funded. So you're going to want to make sure that they're in really tip-top shape and that don't be afraid to repeat yourself. So if you've said certain things in the research plan, but they're really important about your project, make sure that you find a way to put that information also in the forms that have the asterisk behind them.
Which side of the screen is?
Sorry, the side in blue is the half that goes to programmatic review. After the presentation today, I'm going to send my slides to Juliana and Nina so that they can send them out too, so that you don't have to worry if you didn't catch something. Okay. All right. So I want to talk about a few tips for building a strong application. And one thing that I'm just going to briefly touch on is there are lots of ways to find a partner. And if you'd like to, if you're doing breast cancer and breast cancer research and you're having a bit of difficulty, definitely send me an email or give me a call so we can talk about what steps you might want to take to find your partner. So one of the things to think about is when you're looking at a potential funding source, there are a few questions you need to ask yourself about whether or not this is the right funding source for you. You want to find out about their deadlines, their policies, their procedures, and what are the topics that they fund. And then find out about what kinds of assistance opportunities are there for potential applicants. One of the things that you can do when you're making that initial outreach to a program officer is to send them maybe a page or shorter outline of your project. That really helps them to get a sense of what you're doing. It allows them to kind of read it when they may be checking email late at night or early in the morning. They can read it on their own time schedule. And it helps you have a nice entryway into a call that you might make because they already have a little bit of information about what you're planning to do. I mentioned a couple different sources earlier, but here's the web address for CCPH. And then also here in California, for folks who are based here, there's a community-based research listserv at the CSU system. And so CCE at calstate.edu is the group to get it, the email to send an email to be asked to be added to the listserv. So when you're building a strong application, what you want to do is get feedback throughout the process of putting your application together. You're going to want to ask community leaders, and you're going to want to ask other scientists to read your application. One of the best things that you can do is to give your application to someone who is not in your area and ask them to read it and give you feedback on what you're doing. It's really important to pay attention to the details. Normally you talked about this in your presentation, but really making sure that you set up your application so that it's easy to read. Each application usually that comes through our offices has about 150 pages to it. So in addition to, sort of like the basic research plan, there's also the resume of each person. There's appendices and things that they might have included there. So the pages really add up. Everything that you can do as applicants to make that reader have an easier time, actually benefits your application. Because when you think about it, if somebody's reading 8 applications that are 150 pages long, and yours doesn't have spelling errors, or the words aren't too tightly packed on the page, you're going to create a better feeling on the part of the reviewer. So make sure to adhere to the, all the rules of what it says in the application guidelines. When you're painting a picture of your proposal, what you really want to do is build your rationale. So talk about why this work is needed and why you are the team to do it. Those are the 2 things that you really have to get across in your proposal to the reviewers. And there are a number of different ways that you do this in writing a grant proposal. But you want to talk about the community principal investigator, what their expertise is, and what is their connection to the community. And how are they a conduit both toward the community and back from the larger community that you're interested in working with. So how is this community PI really part of the community? How is the scientific PI an expert in the methods that you're going to use? And how do they have expertise in the content area that you're looking at? And why are you a partnership? What is it? How have you come together? How have you formed your partnership? And do you have a feasible, a reasonable plan for doing the work? And is it very clear? So provide context. The reviewers need to know about your community and know what its strengths and assets are. There may be things that your community is struggling with, but also highlighting what are the strengths of your community that you bring to this partnership and that you're going to bring to the proposal and the work itself. Really important too is describing what your process is. Norval was making a nice point earlier about talking about people coming back and forth to meet, describing that kind of thing in your application, but also how did you get together, how did you meet, what are your shared values, what are the things that you, from the community side and the academic side, find important, and how is this manifest in your procedures? So describing your methods as well. So how are you going to actually accomplish your project? What methods are you going to use? How are you going to divide up the funds? So making sure that each partner is getting an equal share of the funding that you're asking for. And if you're not making that decision to do it that way, why? So sometimes applications that come through the CVCRP will have 100% of the funds go to the community. And the reason why is that it's very important that it's set up that way. They may have access to specific positions or community networkers or different things where it makes much more sense for all that money to go there. We're very concerned when 100% of the funds go to the academic partner because to us that really isn't showing necessarily that this is a CVPR project. Another important thing to think about is when you're communicating through your application with reviewers, can you tell them about what are some of the limitations of your project and why you decided that you actually thought about alternative ways to do what you're planning to do, but you decided against that. So a lot of their process is going to be pointing out how there's another way you could have gotten at this, or there's another methodology that you could have used. That's their job as a reviewer, to make sure you're using the best ways to get a research project done. So if you head them off at the pass and you already tell them, we thought about this or we considered that, but we decided not to, and here's our rationale, that saves a lot of time in the review process, and it shows that you've really thought through exactly what you're doing and why. So here's my contact information, and as I mentioned, I'm going to send these slides out to Juliana and Nina, but if you have a chance to jot it down, please do. And we'd like to open up for questions for both Norval and I to have a chance to respond to. Thank you. So in hearing the content that we provided today, what are some of the things that are on your mind when you think about applying for a grant? What are some of the questions that you have?
I have a question. When you spoke about putting in money for indirect costs, I work for an institution of research, and our indirect costs are very high.
Yeah.
What percentage do you guys cover?
We honor your percentage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it really depends. Do you have any limitations to the indirect costs?
I think if you're partnering with someone at a University of California right now, indirects are capped at 25%. So if that's a $100,000 grant, that means 25,000 would go for indirects to keep the lights on, like Senaida said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the only limitations. So we honored indirect costs, like for Kaiser, you have one that's probably federally negotiated.
Yeah, it's pretty high.
Yeah, so they can be pretty high. But we would need proof of that indirect rate that you've negotiated, and we would pay that.
Thank you.
The other thing is that if you don't have a negotiated rate, we'll honor 25%. So if you don't have a rate on file, we will put 25% on top of the direct costs. Yeah.
Do you fund graduate student thesis projects or research or anything?
We do. Yes, we would. If you're at the stage of about to propose your dissertation, so like at the time to come in, usually we have to talk to the person applying because there is a timing issue. You can't be like first year graduate student, we're talking to doctoral students, but you also don't want to be too, you've already proposed your dissertation. There is a window that we look at where you are in your training. If someone already has a grant and say they want to bring on someone who has a bachelor's degree to encourage them to stay in research, that's where we have the Cornelius Hopper fellowships. And they're reviewed less, it's a different review criteria for that. It's not like a full proposal, it's a much shorter proposal, and that's $15,000 a year up to 2 years. So that's a supporter trainee that might work with a mentor on a project, but the mentor already has a grant with us for those.
I'm a master's degree student. Do you have any master's awards?
We don't just independently for masters at that level of training at the master's level. You'd have to have a PI that has a grant with us. Like you have to work with someone that already has a grant with us to be eligible for at least the Cornelius Hopper. Okay. Yes.
I don't know if this is a pertinent question to funding, but you stress that you personally, especially with research, the tobacco and equity. And the reason why we are here, we want to came from Tacoma, is because we have a grant from the CDC in which equity is the key. And this is the responsibility of the organization that we are representing here. We have to, we are working with both coalitions and ours, which has the responsibility that every one of the other coalitions work with equity. And one of them is tobacco. In your description, you just whet my appetite. How are you doing how are you putting together the tobacco and equity? In the others, I have not too much problem, but this is specific one. I approached them and said, well, what are you talking about?
In equity, I look at it as equity on the level of the people involved in doing the research. So there's two levels, and the community. So when I'm looking at proposals that are coming in that address a health disparity, then I'm looking at how is this going to promote equity or a social justice related issue in tobacco at the community level. And we do fund that kind of work. Sometimes if it's really, if the work informs policy or you're trying to influence policymakers, then we're going to kind of, I would refer you or that person to my colleague Phil Gardner, who's going to really help you shape or talk about how to some considerations for preparing the work you do to inform policy, particularly. Now, if you're looking at trying to promote equity, among a group, you're trying to get a partnership, you're focused on a behavior or a health issue at the community level, however you define community, then that would come to me because I'm more the behavioral, in the work, in the study section, my reviewers are looking a little bit more on the behavioral side. The work might have implications for policy, but that might be a little bit more downstream, not as direct as when it's direct policy research. I don't know if that gets to answering your question, but.
I think that
Okay. Okay, we can talk some more, so I get a better.
I was wondering if you have examples of successful grants that are either available on your website or could be shared, because I think one of the things that I would love to see is models of successful CBPR grant applications.
And that's one of the technical assistance products that we're trying to build right now. The issues that come with sharing a grant is that this is someone else's work and they may or may not feel comfortable. So we definitely can't share somebody's grant without their permission. But one of the things that we've been thinking about with regard to technical assistance is how do you show people examples of what works in the review process versus what doesn't work? So it's an excellent question. Hopefully there'll be more to come on that one.
I would just the only thing I would add, she's right, confidentiality-wise, I can't send you someone's grant proposal, but we do have abstracts on our database. You know, both breast cancer, tobacco. If you go to our websites, you'll see what we funded to date, and you'll at least see the abstracts. And breast cancer puts multiple versions, so as a person does, you know, year 2 of the research, year 3, they'll have it revised, and it will reflect the progress in the study. I also encourage people to reach out. If you see a person that has a grant that you're like, that's my area, I'm interested, email them, contact them, and say, hey, you know, would you mind sharing your application? That's what we, you know, because when we get requests for that, that's usually what we do.
But what about actually as an organization asking the people who you funded if you could share their full grant?
So that's what I was pointing to. That's what I was suggesting that we're working on, is actually finding an applicant that would be, or a successfully funded grantee that would be willing to share part or all of their application, which I think would be a really nice thing to be able to provide. Yeah. Yep.
It sounds like both of your organizations have been funding CBPR research for a while now. I'm just curious about the trends and the types of projects that you've funded over the years. If you kind of seen anything interesting that's changed since.
Yes. There's a lot, and there's a lot of trends that we've seen. I'm going to speak just from my perspective in a breast cancer funder. One of the things that we've seen over the years that's been incredibly encouraging is a consistent focus on disparities in the applications that come to us in the area of CBPR. They could be focusing on anything, but the fact that they're focusing on problems, unequal burden of breast cancer among women who are in populations of color, or sexual minorities, or many different topics that they've been coming through consistently, and that's been very encouraging. One of the things that we're seeing now and we're trending toward is more communities getting interested in etiology of breast cancer, so what's happened to actually create the disease in the first place. And that's been quite exciting because communities are now getting really interested in figuring out why is breast cancer happening more often? Why aren't women getting the support that they need? Or why aren't they getting the treatment that they need for breast cancer? Prevention is a new topic that's coming up in breast cancer, and it's a very hard question to answer, but I think it's very encouraging that a lot of communities are interested in learning what can they do to actually prevent the disease from happening in the first place. So those are a couple of areas that I'm seeing differences in the applications that are coming through.
That's a very good question to ask, especially a funder. But I would say for tobacco, there's been, we go through cycles where in certain years, in terms of disparity applications, people will focus on certain groups and it'll shift. And I would say that maybe in some of the earlier years, we had more applications focused on tobacco issues affecting African American communities, and that's kind of declined in more recent years. But then applications focused on specific Asian American ethnic groups or communities is increasing, where people are really, you know, beginning to say you can't treat Asian Americans as a whole. You got to focus on does this work with Vietnamese smokers, Filipino smokers, and really kind of our they might look at youth that are Southeast Asian youth, and I've seen more of that movement going. Tobacco use among people with mental illness, that's also more, we're getting more applications and interest in that area. So we set the priorities, but there's enough wiggle room there that people can come in and say, okay, I really want to focus on military population. We're getting more interested in community colleges and getting smoke-free policies and resources available in California and 112 community college campuses. So I am seeing that movement. I think it's challenging from a funder's perspective in terms of, I showed that chart with the dwindling dollars and being able to fund good research, some stuff that is innovative but might not be quite ready for prime time, that might have gotten funded 5 years ago, might not make it. So sometimes there's innovative stuff, you're like, that's where we need to go, but the reviewers look at the methods and things and they say, they need to refine this and that. And that, even as a funder, that's discouraging because you see we want to move the field forward, we want to address these disparities, and I might see that there's potential there, but it has to reach that certain level when it goes through the review process.
Yeah, we got two questions. Man in the black jacket.
My question is about the process of the application. Where is it important? Can we insert, which part can we insert stories, real stories, experience of people affected by the problem that we're trying to ask?
And I wonder, there are a ton of different ways that you could insert it into an application. I'm wondering what area you're thinking about. Like, what are you thinking about? Breast cancer? Are you thinking about tobacco? Are you thinking about some other aspect of research? What is your topic area you're thinking about?
Because I'm trying to, both of those are a problem that is in my mind, and tobacco and breast cancer. Breast cancer, I'm looking at it right now, but I don't have a research. I just be part of the navigation program.
Okay, got you. So there's a lot of ways that people do that in a grant application itself. What you're talking about, the stories of the people, when you take that and you put it into a research language for a grant application, some of that is called qualitative data. It is called the actual experience of a woman impacted, in our case, by breast cancer. So there are many ways that you could, the narrative piece of it, you could include a quote or something within the application itself. If you want to include a longer description, a longer narrative from a woman, you might include that in an appendix to a grant application. But I would love to talk with you a little bit more offline about what specifically you're thinking of including, because I might be able to give you a little bit more direct kind of guidance. Yeah, Nina?
Well, I have a question for all of us. Those of us committed to equity in CBPR and disparity, the challenge is how do you, I think I raised this, I'm not sure if I raised it in a large group before, but there's this kind of debate in the field about focusing on, the very specific utilitarian agenda, goals of a grant to improve screening or find etiology or to, address disparities in the kind of populations that we're working with, whether it's youth or whether it's, a particular subgroup of Asian American populations. But some of what we've been hearing through the Institute is the importance of, changing policy and really affecting the environment, the conditions that cause, taking CBPR as a broader social movement, looking at really challenging inequitable conditions. I don't know if that's what you were thinking of when you said equity. So I'm kind of interested in this nexus of how we do it with grants, when we have a bigger vision, and how do we use these grants to impact bigger visions. And I think it's a struggle for all of us. So I would love your comments on that, if you've seen that in your grant applications at all, and also to raise the question for us as a community here trying to struggle with equity issues. How do we really use opportunities that are funding opportunities to really address injustice and the biggest issues. For example, not related to cancer, one of the case studies that we had a chance to visit was, as part of our national effort, was in the Blue Hill of Missouri, with rural, poor African American community, a lot of evidence of historical policies that just hold the segregation right there. Zoning policies that don't allow blacks to have access to water for their land. Things like it. Just really incredible policies. They got a cardiovascular disease grant around physical activity, nutrition, and used that as a way to build sustainable agriculture and jobs for African American men. And they're still in the process of doing that, and they're at the same time working with the white mayors to change zoning around access to water and land. So they're kind of using cardiovascular disease as the entree, but trying to deal with racism as the, and it's a real struggle. This is not a one thing or another. So I'm kind of just intrigued by that question, and then you had comments and then other comments. Yeah, sure. And I didn't know, it's kind of building from your question on equity.
I think one of the big things that kind of came up in my mind as you were speaking was the importance of getting the research outcomes into the hands of policy makers and shapers. That's one piece. And then considering becoming one of the policy makers and shapers is another piece. So I think that one of the most powerful things that teams can do is have a vision of why are you collecting this data? What impact could it have on health immediately, and then think about your trajectory long term. What impact could it have on health for the community, and then the broader community? So is that at the sort of regional level, is it the state level, is it the national level? The piece that's really important there, I think, is making connections and networking with folks who are impacting the policy, and also learning about how to have an impact on that process is what I'm getting at. So my thinking is that the research results, getting them into the hands of the people who are actually going to vote on these measures or actually bring a bill before committee or what have you, can be a really powerful impact. But I'm also interested in knowing about what your experience has been with trying to impact policy or trying to, yeah. So I think it is sort of a nexus. I don't think we've figured it out yet, but I think that this is the next piece that has to be seriously considered. Why are we doing this research and why are we putting the dollars toward it? It's to have an impact. And how do we end up having an impact? And I don't want to take all that out, but yeah. So really thinking about, what is your goal for your partnership and where do you eventually want to get 4 years to 20 years down the line? What is it and where do you want your partnership to have an impact? And then how are you going to go about that? If it's tough enough to crack, I think.
I would just add, I think that Senaida said it beautifully, and this is speaking to the heart. As an organization, we're looking about how the work we fund can have a better, bigger impact in communities. And I'm really seeing, and there's more of a, when we talk about trends you were asking about, there is a focus on trying to partner with people who do policy at different levels. Whether it's having actual policy researchers or going to policymakers and saying, what do you need, in terms of what we, and it's usually a little easier if you start at the local level. So, what is needed, to convince city councils? And having a partnership, so someone who does that advocacy work is working with someone who does the research early on. So the researcher is thinking with a policy lens that they're not necessarily trained to do, and the policymaker is also learning the language and how to help guide and get the wording right so a policy is easily digestible by a policymaker. And I mean, California, there have been advances in advancing smoke-free policies and multi-unit housing, apartments and things of that nature, and it's kind of really just focused at the local level and just gradually built. And the way California works, at least with tobacco control, is once enough municipalities or counties adopt something, it's more likely to pass muster at the state level. And then you get We help partner people with American Lung Association, American Heart Association, people who have the resources, the big guns to take the policy message forward. So, but at the other end, as a funder, it is important for us to structure our research priorities so that they can inform policy. But then the researcher has to be willing, that's where the collaboration is so needed. We're seeing that in the field. You just can't have one person working in a silo. They gotta, at some point, connect with people at varying levels so that the work they're doing is meaningfully gonna lead to policy decisions that can impact community, and it's articulated in a way that can be understood at the community level for saying why this is an issue, for the policymaker, why there needs to be a change, and then research, and we fund some of this with multi-unit housing, how is it being enforced, communicated, things of that nature. So it's a tracking process. And as you evaluate too, that strengthens your policy. You have some data there that says, before we did this, X happened, we did this, something better, Y, Z happened. And those are, when I'm thinking about this, we're all struggling and trying to make this, move the needle forward in that direction to reduce disparities, but that's where I'm seeing it's the collaborative work.
One other thing I wanted to note too is finding out which funders specifically are trying to fund policy research could be a really advantageous thing to do. And one of the things that I thought also is that there's been this recent sort of NIH dust-up over funds being used to impact policy. So as much as there are people who support research impacting policy, there's also a whole camp of people who are very much against research impacting policy. So understanding where the funder is, understanding what the network is. I'm thinking of the power mapping sessions that you had yesterday, and just thinking about really knowing what the playing field looks like. That can go a huge way toward your team having the impact that you hope for. Any other questions out of anything? And any other questions or any other comments that the group wanted to add to that policy question? Any successes that you've had with impacting policy as a result of your partnership, or that you hope to have as a result of your partnership? Okay, we can move to a different question. Go ahead.
And it's not very well formulated, but the idea of having a real partnership and creating a grant, but not having money to actually do the time that it will cost. Do you have any suggestions about how to deal with that, especially with, asking, for instance, community members maybe be on an affiliate?
Right.